Welcome to Practical Talk Time. I'm your host, Usha Kumar. Last week we had a wonderful show on domestic violence, and this week we're going to talk about sexual assault. And I have here with me Rodwell Lawton, who's from the Women's Center of Greater Danbury, and she's here to discuss this wonderful topic that is so appropriate for today's events and things that are going on in our society. And on this show, we have handled many such social issues and questions, and how to recognize symptoms of all kinds of abuse and social problems. And we are trying to bring awareness to our viewers in this regard, and also make them participate in trying to prevent these kinds of violences and social injustices. So please join me in welcoming Anne. Anne,
Hi.
welcome to the show.
Thank you.
It is wonderful to have you here. You have a master's degree in social work, and then you're also certified in domestic violence and sexual assault counseling.
Correct.
And you have so much experience having worked with children and adults and in so many social work and the social subjects.
Yes.
Often what happens is in society, people do live in families and groups, and sometimes they're not aware of how they behave and how their behavior affects those around them, whether it's in their own household or at work or even in the general society. So in order to bring such awareness, I try to bring experts like yourself to come on this show and talk about the needs of how to recognize the symptoms, how to learn to prevent bad things from happening to good people. Because generally everybody wants to be good, right? On an average. And there's no reason why domestic violence and sexual assault should happen.
Right.
But before we proceed to the sexual assault subject that we want to talk about today, let us talk a little bit about domestic violence and how your organization, the Women's Center of Greater Danbury, helps people with that.
So we work around issues of domestic violence, and we help survivors get out of domestic and abusive relationships if that's what they want to do. If not, we can work with survivors to manage that relationship and the trauma that they might be occurring from that relationship.
Last week we talked about the prevalence of domestic violence, why we are seeing more of it today. We should imagine that we'll have less of it with all the education and all the public media information available to people, and also how women stay in abusive relationships. So can you give just a little pointer on how to prevent it, how to recognize it?
So warning signs of domestic violence or abusive relationships usually center around power and control over another human being. So if someone is very controlling of your behavior, wants to know what you're doing, when you're doing it, and is very possessive or jealous, they can say that that's because they love you and want to take care of you. But often those can be warning signs that they want to be very controlling over you, and that can lead to abusive behavior.
And what has happened when things cross the line and get to a really violent point? What happens?
Well, there are many different forms of abuse that can occur. So usually we think of physical violence, right? Hitting, pushing, throwing people down a flight of stairs. And we see that, and that's easy for us to recognize because there are bruises and people are sent to the hospital. But there are many other forms of violence. So we have verbal abuse, right? Putting someone down, saying that they won't amount to anything, no one would ever want them or love them. And then that translates into emotional abuse, where the perpetrator plays head games with the victim. They think they're responsible for what's happening to them. They believe that they can't get out of this relationship because often they've been isolated from their family.
So the victims blame themselves.
Yes, and that's a lot of emotional abuse, and the perpetrator playing those head games and manipulating the survivor to think that they can't get out and that they're to blame for what's happening to them. And then also we see economic abuse and also sexual abuse, which ties into what we're going to talk about today in more in depth, but we also see sexual abuse happening in domestic violence relationships.
And sometimes when it gets out of hand and there are homicides happening, where does that come from and what can be done to prevent that?
Well, we need to educate the community about the dynamics of domestic violence. We know that when guns are present in a household, the risk of homicide happening is also dramatically increased, and that when survivors go to leave, that's the most dangerous time for them, and they're at the highest risk of homicide. So having in the news recently, we've seen a lot about gun control. We want to make sure that abusers don't have guns readily available so that they cannot kill their partners.
But most of these people in the domestic situation, they don't have any priors, they don't have any, they're not in the criminal justice system, basically. So
it's hard.
When it happens, it's just too late, because at that point, it's just too late. Better not to get the guns to who?
Yeah, it's hard because we often don't know who abusers are and when they're going to abuse and when they're going to turn violent. And that's something that we're trying to figure out, what is the best way to monitor that and recognize these signs right away. And there really isn't a clear-cut answer at the moment.
In domestic violence means the victim could be anyone. It can be an adult, it could be a child, it could be other relatives in the area, or even friends, neighbors, right?
Anyone in an intimate relationship, their partner can be abusive to them.
So, well, on that note, a little bit of gun control is needed there. On that note, we'll move on to our sexual assault topic that we wanted to discuss. As far as women's centers experience goes, what has been your experience with this? Is there a lot of this happening?
This sexual assault is very prevalent in our society. It's often not talked about and is normalized a lot of the time. We make excuses for perpetrators for why they're sexually assaulting people. And so we really have to have conversations about this. And we know that this affects many people. 1 in 3 women will be a victim of sexual assault in her lifetime. 1 in 6 men will be a victim of sexual assault. Those are huge numbers and great portions of our population who now have to deal with the trauma of sexual assault, and this has lifelong devastating effects on a person.
What are all the definitions of, what is the definition of sexual assault?
Sexual assault is an act of power and control when one person forces or manipulates another into unwanted sexual activity. So it's important to know that this sexual activity and behavior is unwanted. The survivor or victim does not want this to occur, and that this other person is using power and control over that person. So sexual assault isn't about sex. It's not about people who need sexual gratification. That's something completely different. This is someone abusing their power and control over someone that they usually know. 86% of sexual assault is done by someone the victim knows, an acquaintance. And then also it's important to know that force or manipulation can be present. But force doesn't have to be present for sexual assault to occur. In fact, force, pushing someone down on the bed, using a weapon, that usually does not happen in sexual assault. There's other manipulation going on that's manipulating this person into that behavior.
So other than the physical aspect, it could be the mental aspect or the coercion aspect of it.
Absolutely. The perpetrator gains the survivor's trust. So the survivor will have their guard down and trust this person and not be alerted to these warning signs because there was someone they know. And also the victim will be manipulated, saying, if you loved me, you would do this. Why are you making this such a big deal?
That's a blackmail aspect too.
Yeah.
Okay.
Manipulation, blackmail,
Emotional,
threats.
emotional blackmail.
Absolutely.
So when is it okay, people can live with it, or they can somehow turn things around? And when is it crossing the line with this?
So often we think that it's a kind of a gray area. How do we know if someone's been assaulted?
Exactly.
It's he said, she said. But it all comes down to consent and whether the non-initiator consented to this activity. So whoever's initiating this sexual activity or behavior, it is their responsibility to gain consent from that other person.
Okay.
And consent is enthusiastically and willingly agreeing to this sexual behavior. So we don't often talk about consent in our society, and it's kind of awkward to think about consenting to all sexual activity.
Yeah, I can't imagine people every time having like a contract or an agreement and saying, okay, I consent to this. That doesn't happen, right? I mean,
It's not.
Who's willingly saying it before they get into a more intimate relationship?
So you're right, we don't see that in our society. It's not how we're brought up, but we're trying to at least get consent into the conversation, because we don't want to have sexual activity with someone and realize that we assaulted them. And the only way we know for sure that they want to consent is to have that conversation and for them to say yes. So if we want
every time in today's world, one has to make sure the other person has consented verbally.
Yes, exactly. So every time there's a sexual encounter, consent needs to be gained. Even if you've had sex with this person in the past, you still need to get consent now, and with every escalation of behavior too.
What if a person doesn't say anything, and so the other person assumes that is consent?
You can't assume consent. Okay. There should be no doubt in your mind that this person wants to engage in this behavior. So silence does not equal consent. We need to have actual verbal yes. We need to imagine, this person doing backflips and is so excited for this to happen. There really should be no doubt in our mind that this person wants to do X, Y, and Z with us, and they said yes, and consent has happened.
So since when has this new rule been enforced? Because in the past, if you looked at literature and material, storybooks, whatever you've read, very often only when one person says no, it means they're not consenting to whatever they are up to doing. So when there is no being said, they do not assume that it is no, and they just assume that it is yes.
Yeah, we often think our society tells us that no is a maybe that might turn into a yes, but we really need to honor when someone says no. That means they don't want to do it.
Yeah, when they say no, it's very clear it's no. But when they don't say the no, it does not mean what you're saying is, it doesn't mean that they're not saying no.
Right, so silence does not mean yes. That doesn't mean they're consenting.
It does not mean yes.
Yeah, and also it's important to know that the trauma that's happening to a brain during a sexual assault, and the brain understands that it's in danger, and often victims have this freeze response where they don't say no, they don't fight back, and that's the trauma happening in their brain, and they freeze. 88% of survivors see this. So often they'll look back and say, why didn't I fight back? Why did I not say no? And it was their body shutting down and having that freeze response.
Basically paralyzed feeling. Yeah.
Paralyzed, yeah. So we need to make sure if you're not feeling in danger, then you're not going to have that response, and you're going to be able to say, yes, I consent.
But that kind of thing will only happen with someone that you don't know. This kind of paralyzation, right?
It can happen.
It does not happen with people they're dating or someone that they know.
It can still happen with people that you know. Again, most sexual assaults occur by someone who the victim knows. So we do see this happen. Even if you know you're a perpetrator, it's still a very dangerous position, and the brain still has that response. Even if you know that person, you still feel like you're in danger and you're in fear.
In terms of preventing such sexual assault, what steps can be taken by the common person?
Yeah, well, the first step is talking about consent and gaining consent in all of your sexual relations. And so we are in the schools talking about consent, talking about sexual assault.
I see.
It's also important to know when someone cannot consent to sexual activity. Do you know when that is?
Well, what is the age when a boy or a girl has the ability to consent?
So it varies by state, but in Connecticut, the age of consent is 16.
16?
So 16,
That
yeah.
is awfully low
You think
number.
that's low?
But I think people are active by then, some children. I guess.
Absolutely. We know that kids are engaging in sexual activity at a very young age. So actually, in their minds, 16 is a very high number. But 16 is the age when the government says that you are old enough to know what you're getting into and can make that decision for yourself.
And that's good news for the children, I guess. Right? And for parents to understand that their child, once they reach the age of 16, that they do have a right to consent or not consent.
They do.
Yeah.
So age is a factor in whether someone can consent. The other factor is if that person has been impaired. Often we think of drugs and alcohol.
Drugs and alcohol, yes.
So it's important to know that if someone is under the influence of drugs or has been drinking, they cannot consent. We don't know if they're in the right mindset to understand what is going on. And it is best to not have sex with that person, because even if they say yes, we don't know how impaired they are, how much they've been drinking. And it's safe to just not go there and to wait.
So that will lead the other person to legal problems later on. If they do engage in something, in a relationship with that person, when the other person is impaired. So what do they do after a few drinks at night, and then, so they'll have to just walk away?
Yeah, we suggest that either person has been drinking or has been using drugs, that you should not engage in sexual activity, because you really don't know if that person wants to engage in that with you. And when they aren't impaired and in the right mind, will they still want to do that?
I think that's going to be a very difficult call to make at the social scene.
Exactly, it's very hard, especially on college campuses where we see dating and alcohol mixing at the party scene. Like, that's where people are meeting their partners, that's where they're drinking. And so how do we kind of not intermingle those things and make sure that we're having healthy sexual relations?
Yeah, and I've also heard cases where some girls, they date, and then when the relationship doesn't go the way they want, and if the guy wants to drop her or whatever, then they turn around and say the guy raped her. And so such things have been happening too at the college level. So sometimes it's a tricky situation for youngsters to be getting into this kind of situation.
Yeah, we actually see that most survivors do not falsify sexual assault.
Okay.
That is actually very rare. So we need to believe survivors when they come forward and say that they have been assaulted. Obviously, perpetrators are most likely going to deny it because now they're going to get in trouble. But usually survivors do not have many reasons to falsify this report. I mean, they're damaging their reputation, everything that they have to go through legally in the legal process. So we really need to believe survivors when they come forward.
So when, as far as the law is concerned, they side with the victim here?
The laws
do
don't
not?
always side with the victim, and it really can go by a case-by-case basis. Again, it depends on what state you're in, age of consent, and whether impairment laws due to drugs and alcohol do vary a little bit by each state. So each case is different and unique, and it really isn't clear-cut what will happen in the legal process.
What is the situation in Connecticut? Of course, we know the age is 16, age of consent. So as far as the drinking or being under the influence of drugs before they consent,
Yes.
then I know with the contract law, anything that's done under duress, under coercion is not valid. The contract is not valid. So now this one person might argue, hey, she said yes, or she says he said yes, and now this is happening.
So the sexual assault movement says in general that if someone is under the influence of drugs and alcohol, they cannot consent. So that's what we like to promote and to tell others, because again, we don't know if this person really wants to engage in that activity. However, a lot of state laws, and in Connecticut, says that someone can't consent when they are passed out and unconscious from drugs or alcohol.
That is very obvious, though.
So that's obvious.
Yes.
But this really
you
puts
still
us
have
in
the
a
gray
bad
area
spot, and you have
in
that
between.
gray area.
Yeah.
And so that's what's hard when you go through the legal process, trying to determine whether this person was in the right mindset and really was impaired. But to be safe, let's just remember to not do drugs and alcohol and mix that with sexual activity, just so we cover our butts. We know that we're not assaulting others, and make sure we live in a safe society.
Yeah, people have to be aware that even if they think that they're getting into a safe situation, with their activities, that they really may not be in a safe situation. And this is a good thing for people to know, that they have to walk away if they think the other person is inebriated or under the influence of drugs or whatever. They should just say, okay, I'll see you next time when you're not under the influence of these. I think that's a very good pointer, especially for the youngsters, I guess.
Yes.
But sometimes even older people fall into this trap.
Absolutely.
People think that they've been at it for 20, 30 years, and then boom, they come across a new girlfriend or boyfriend, and then this happens, and then before they know it, they are being accused of a sexual assault, which they may not have even meant to happen.
Exactly. So that's why education is key, because when we talk to boys and men, often they don't realize these rules of consent. And so they don't realize that what they're doing actually is sexual assault. So we need to make sure we're having these conversations with the males in our life and the young men in our life.
As far as the non-physical sexual assaults, can you talk a little bit about that and what is being discussed today on that topic?
So all sexual assaults involve sexual activity, but again, force isn't always used. So people can be manipulated into these behaviors, and we need to make sure if someone says yes and is consenting, that they're not doing that out of fear. They're not doing that because they're being manipulated into that behavior. The
Women's Center itself, how do you come across such sexual assaults, and what do you do to help the victims?
So we often have a lot of victims call our hotlines. We can talk to them through the next steps, whether that is reporting to the police. Again, that doesn't have to occur, and we can talk through those options. We can talk through the option of going to the hospital and getting a rape kit done. If you get a rape kit done, you do not have to report. So that's something we need to understand.
Yeah, that people would assume that once it goes to that level, it gets reported automatically. But it's not true.
It's
you
not
don't
true.
have to.
So you can go to the hospital, you can get evidence collected through a rape kit, and then you can decide whether you want to report and that evidence can be used. So we suggest going to the hospital because evidence is only good for a couple of days after an assault. Once that's gone, you can't get it back. So at least have that evidence, get the kit done, and then make the decision afterwards whether you want to do that. But we also honor survivors if they don't want to go through that, because it's an invasive, uncomfortable exam, and they've already experienced all this trauma, and it's hard.
It's the last thing they want to be experiencing again.
Absolutely. It's the last thing they want to do. They want to go home. They want to hide under their covers from what's happened to them. But we do have really great nurses who are trained in sexual assault in doing these exams and understand a survivor's response. We also have advocates from the Women's Center who go to the hospital and will work with the survivor and coach them through what's happening, take breaks if necessary, understand the trauma that's happening, and make sure that victims aren't being re-victimized through going to the hospital or going to the police.
In terms of their emotional trauma as a result of this, what help can they get to get over that?
Well, you really need someone who understands trauma, understands how that affects a survivor's brain and their functioning, and then affects their behavior. Because often we see survivors exhibit odd behaviors after a sexual assault that are kind of counterintuitive. That's because the trauma affects the structure of the brain. So knowing how to approach survivors from a trauma-sensitive and trauma-informed perspective, and also coming from an empowerment perspective, giving that power and control back to the survivor and having them take control over their counseling, making their own goals for what they want to accomplish, and bringing that back into the survivor's life.
So basically they might feel depressed or feel antisocial, they don't feel like talking to anyone, they withdraw.
So often
and that is when they really need to go and get the help, and they don't want to go and get the help at that point.
Yeah, we see a lot of depression happening, people staying at home, often anxiety happens, a lot of anxiety disorders, living in fear, living in isolation, blaming themselves for what's happening. Also a lot of shame and guilt, right? We shame sexual assault survivors saying, you could have fought back, why were you wearing that, why were you drunk? We blame victims.
Why were you out so late?
Exactly. When really we should be asking, why did the perpetrator choose to do this? And women shouldn't live their life in fear, should be able to wear what they want, should be able to walk the streets at night and not question their safety.
Well, that now includes a lot of other things. How safe the community is, how safe their surroundings are, and safety in numbers and things like that. I guess no one should just be loitering around alone late in the night.
So there are things you can do to reduce your risk, right? Walk with other people, not be out
go
late
on a
at
buddy
night.
system, go have someone checking on you. And
yes, but really the real work we need to be doing is preventing sexual violence, getting men involved in the movement, having them understand what consent is, that's not okay to assault people, that they know, and really do some bigger change societal work.
Thank you very much, Anne. That was wonderful advice. We really enjoyed it. I hope you all enjoyed and got some good information out of this show. Thank you all for watching. If you have any questions or comments, please write to practicaltalktime@yahoo.com. You can also go to the Women's Center's website for help. Thank you all for watching. Until next time, goodbye.